Good day, everyone. We're back with the breaking news from the West Coast, or Northwest specifically. We start this hour with out of Portland, Oregon, where the far-right nationalist group, the Proud Boys, have gathered for a rally and a show of opposition to anti-fascists. Also on site, counter-protesters, local law enforcement out in force, monitoring the situation in case clashes between both sides break out. You see our cameras there. We have several cameras that are there on scene. NBC's Scott Cohn is on the ground in Portland right now. The co-founder and managing editor of Beat DC, Tiffany Cross, is here as well. And Republican strategist and former Nevada State Republican chairwoman Amy Tarkanian monitoring all of this. But of course, we're going to start there in Portland, in the Pacific Northwest, and the latest on the situation there, Scott.
Let me orient you to where we are, and again, forgive the police loudspeaker. What they are telling people is move to the sidewalks now, get out of the streets. Nobody has a permit to be marching in the street. This street is Nadeau Parkway, which runs along the west end of the McCall Riverfront Park. On the east end is the Willamette River, and the protest has been slowly moving to the south, which is where we're going. With just a sizable number of the what we might call the counter-protesters, the Antifa, and their sympathizers, who are trying to confront the Proud Boys and the groups on the right that have staged this rally. They say to try and end domestic terrorism, and it gets to be a battle of who is the terrorist here, and that's what they're talking about. So far, it's been loud, it's been tense at times, but we haven't seen anything in the way of violence. What we have seen is a few arrests. We have seen, according to the police department, they've confiscated some weapons, things like sticks and shields and things like that. And the other thing that they're saying is that the groups are infiltrating each other. So you may not know just by the dress or the appearance who is who. And that's a concern. The other thing that is really in contrast to protests that we've covered here before, not just the size, because this is considerably larger, but also the fact that the protesters seem to be being allowed a little bit more to converge. In the past, particularly when you had one group with a permit, the police were able to establish sort of a perimeter between them. That doesn't seem to be happening. Just the same, though, the police presence here is sizable. All 1,000 members of the Portland police force are on duty today, most down here, trying to keep things in check. They deployed what they called liaison officers ahead of the protest with the idea that they could try and diffuse things and also get ahead of the criticism that they faced in the past that they were favoring one side over the other. We'll see how that works out. Again, so far, a lot of people, a lot of police, no violence, thankfully, at this point. Back to you.
And Scott, one thing that I noticed that might be a move that the police interacted to try to diffuse the situation there. Just a few minutes earlier, they had a group walk across the Hawthorne Bridge right now, and they say that group is on the other side of the river right now. So you get a sense, at least from what I'm reading from the tea leaves, that they're trying to keep the groups at least separated by the river. Are you getting any sense of that?
Well, so the Hawthorne Bridge was closed, and it was closed as of 4 o'clock this morning with the idea of keeping people out of downtown, keeping people out of this area. But at some point, they have to kind of, I guess, relieve the pressure. People that want to come across, the more that they hold them back, the more tension builds up. And there seems to be a little bit of that. It's sort of hard to tell where the perimeters are either way and how they're going to try and keep folks apart. Clearly, there are a lot of people who came here spoiling for a fight.
Yeah, that indeed. According to the police department, they've seized a number of weapons. Can't help but look at some of the scenes there behind you, Scott, and noticing the unicorn and such, and thinking that Portland is keeping up with the slogan of keeping Portland weird. To Steve Patterson right now, our correspondent who's also there in downtown Portland for us. Steve, I assume that you can hear me. What's the situation where you are?
Candace, I'm at the head of exactly what Scott was talking about, this exodus of counter-protesters moving south along McCall Riverfront Park. The riverfront is directly behind my cameraman. You can kind of see some of the counter-protesters kind of in a herd moving this way. Appears to be a conflict now. You can see it breaking out in the crowd. If we can stop down, Ray, I can show you this. You can see follow me this way, you can see what appears to be counter-protesters and Antifa mixed in the crowd. We've seen the black bloc obviously dispersed, sort of intermixed in the counter-protesting crowd. We just saw a flare-up over here. Want to find out what that's about? We can come this way. You can hear screaming. The crowd, as Scott mentioned, has been tense. There's been a lot of conflict of ideology, of people getting in other people's faces, of some of the far-right protesters moving into the counter-protester crowds. And then, obviously, you can see the result of what happens. Has not, have we seen, come to violence at this point, although we don't know what's happening here. But things are quite tense on the ground. Breaking out in pockets, you see sort of these flare-ups, just like what appears to be happening right now. It is a very chaotic situation. It is a very dynamic situation. And police, I think, are taking not a back seat, but trying to keep the two groups as separate as they can and then jumping in to address any conflicts that flare up. We're obviously monitoring it as it happens, Candace. So send it back to you.
Yeah, but Steve, to follow up on that, you would think that the police would be there right in the mix instead of, how far away are the cops right now?
So there's a police line basically all around us. They're back away from this crowd because they're trying to keep the two larger groups separate. And you can see obviously.
Nothing but love. The power of God is on these streets.
Sir, what are you here for? Why are you protesting today?
For total peace and no fighting. I'm here to see to it that there's no fighting through the power of God. Everybody today has experienced the power of God. By now, this place would have been a bloodbath. And as we praise God and lift up the name of Jesus, the name that is above every name, God is keeping these grounds.
So you can hear, obviously, the emotions running high in the crowd. Hopefully, bloodshed will not happen today. But obviously, tensions are breaking out. To answer your question, though, police have a line that they're trying to keep both of the larger groups separate. They can't jump into every little section of group that breaks out in the crowd, unfortunately. So they're doing the best they can to address the problems that they see when they occur. And obviously, when you see police moving into a crowd, that's a source of agitation in and of itself. So obviously, they want to keep things as tame as they possibly can. And this is the way they're doing it, Candace.
Well, Steve, I hope you stay safe right there. I do know you have your equipment, and just in case things get or turn downhill there. We're going to go to the other side of the street, down the street from where you are, back to Scott Cohen, who's joined by another protester. Scott.
Hi, we are here with Johnny Glennon, who you are a member of Antifa, would you say? What would we...
I would say I'm anti-fascist. I'm definitely not, a member of Antifa.
Fair enough.
But I am anti-fascist, absolutely, and I think we all should be.
Tell me why you're here today.
I'm here to show up with my body and my privilege as a white woman and let them know that it's not okay that they're here, that their presence meaning for violence and destruction and hate. I'm just tired of it. I'm tired of feeling scared, so.
This has played out again and again in Portland, oftentimes breaking out into violence. How concerned are you that this is going to get out of hand?
Oh, I mean, I've been at most of the protests that have happened down here with the Proud Boys, and being firsthand in there, it's never incited from the side of the Antifa kids. I usually position a distance back just to be safe, but to be there. And I've watched the cops consistently corner them all into a small space, and it's like they're tactics that are meant for chaos. These kids are here exercising their right to protest, and you see time and time again the cops are on the side of the fascists. They protect them, they guard them, they give them assistance, they give them not a guided tour, but they essentially escort them.
Well, we'll see how it plays out. Johnny, thank you very much for your time. Candace, we'll send it back to you.
All right, we'll continue to watch those pictures that are coming out of the Tom McCall waterfront in downtown Portland. Our thanks to Scott and Steve. Both gentlemen kindly said that they will stick around with us, and we'll continue to watch those pictures. We have several cameras that are scattered out there as these far left and far right groups come together in downtown Portland, Oregon. What could go wrong? Let's hope it all goes right. And so far, it has been fairly peaceful, at least as far as we can tell, but That said, fairly loud. Let me bring in our panelists as we continue to watch all of this. Amy Tarkanian, who's a Republican strategist and former Nevada State Republican chairwoman, and Tiffany Cross, a co-founder and managing editor of The Beat DC. You've been watching these pictures here with me. Tiffany, you had a congresswoman earlier who was saying this would not take place without the rise of white supremacy and white supremacy feeling more empowered. What do you think?
Well, that was Congresswoman Deborah Haaland, and if anybody's suited to speak on that, it's her. I completely agree. I think it's kind of crazy that you still have these, less than intelligent people come out and say the president's not racist, he's not a white supremacist, and I kind of wonder, what does he have to do for you to acknowledge facts and be a seeing, thinking person and see the things that he says, the policies he's introduced, and the people who support him? And it almost gives a pass to people who think I can be okay with his racism without myself being accused of being a racist. How many times do we have to have a conversation? Is he a white supremacist? That question has been asked and answered. Now it's time to confront this. This almost looks like we're trying to equate the small faction of Antifa with the larger Democratic Party, and that's just not true. The Republican Party has become synonymous with MAGA. The MAGA symbol has become a hate symbol in this country. When I see someone walking towards me in it, I feel uncomfortable. When I get emails, thousands of emails that I've gotten within the last 24 hours from MAGA supporters saying ridiculous things. When I used to appear on another conservative network that's an echo chamber for the Trump campaign, I used to get tons of racist emails. So it's like, look, if you're saying that that's not who this president is, then why do all these people ride with this president? Let me just say really quickly, Candace. I know Nikki Giovanni said, if you can't see the face of the devil, maybe it's because you ride with him. So when people are out defending this president, I think they have to ask themselves, who am I as a person to come and say this and rob people who haven't had my experience and tell them that they don't have a right to call a thing when they see it?
Wow. Well, you came ready. Amy Tarkanian is joining us. And Amy, you had a partially different take. The president, as you know, has called the Antifa group and says he's making major consideration of naming Antifa an organization of terror. What do you think?
I agree with that. They're not just peacefully protesting. You can agree to disagree. Your other panelists said that those who feel that the president and know that the president is not a racist are less intelligent. Well, that's not a very kind statement, and that's still her opinion, but I don't agree with it. But I will not name call. We can go ahead and peacefully have a discussion on certain topics. But when you have groups like Antifa that are not just verbally abusing other opinions, but they are physically abusing other people and using their fists and using weapons and pepper spray, then yes, that is domestic terrorism.
And I should point out, Amy, the Portland Police Department is saying that they have captured weapons from people on both sides, on many sides right now. Have seized weapons from some individuals. They're not saying it's necessarily from the Antifa people. Here's a tweet from them. Portland police officers have seized weapons from some individuals. We have additional road closures that you can see there. Nato Parkway, which I believe is where Scott Cohen was walking a little bit earlier, is now closed, as is the Morrison Bridge and as well as the Hawthorne Bridge. Many of you have been to Portland. You know it is a city of bridges. Tiffany, I'll get you to react in a short second, but I want to go to Steve Patterson, who's there on the ground. Steve.
Hi, yeah, we are continuing to sort of rove with this group, Candace. As you can see, the movement is hot and heavy. The group is sort of pushed across the street from Waterfront Park. Actually, unbelievably almost, this road, you can see, is back open. Somehow police are managing to keep a tight enough hold on this thing to have an open road in the middle of the protesting. On one side, you can see protesters marching back what appears to be north across the street from McCullough Park, which has that waterfront where so many of the protesters and counter-protesters were gathering. It looks like from this point, again, things have been peaceful, things have been sort of rowdy, it's been loud, there's been a large crowd here, but we haven't seen the real violent tension that many may have expected at this point. It looks like the crowds are trying to find each other in some way, trying to intersperse, but police are doing a good job keeping a line on both crowds, keeping containment, so the two groups either don't intermix or intermix peacefully. The flare-ups that we have seen are maybe one 1 or 2 or 3 agitators crossing over to the other group and getting in the faces of people who are just happen to be peacefully protesting. But again, most of what we've seen, drum circles, chanting on both sides, words of positivity for their group, and nothing really that has risen to the level of police taking serious action other than the minor arrests that we've seen so far here, Candace.
And Steve,
back to you.
Do you get a sense that most of them are locals, or are these people from out of town?
Most of the people I've spoken to, at least, are locals, although obviously there are people who have come from out of town from all over either the West Coast or the entire country to come to this event. The problem is, when you're talking to people on one side, it's hard to switch over to each other group because police, again, have this line that they've built between the two groups. But most of the people are native Portlanders. They're obviously concerned about the soul of their city with this going on, but they're trying to keep things as peaceful as they possibly can here.
And so far, it seems that they have been successful. She mentioned police have formed a physical barricade beneath one of the bridges there to separate the rival groups, and things have been vocal, heated, but so far fairly calm. Our thanks to Steve Patterson there in Portland. Steve, we'll check back with you. Appreciate it. As we continue to watch the multiple cameras that we have there in downtown Portland, we're also following.
Well, they're not. And that's where you actually had the bump stocks where they modified on the semi-automatics and turned them into a fully automatic. So that's where we have to be careful on when we're discussing this type of legislation. So that way we don't take away the rights of the millions of people who are acting appropriately and are owning their guns outrightly.
All right, we'll leave it there it's because I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to debate this issue again, sadly, in this country. Let's go back to the pictures that we're getting from the Pacific Northwest right now and out of the Tom McCall Park area, the waterfront area of Portland, where you've had police so far. About 1,000 of them have been on the streets. They've been out there since early this morning, about 4 o'clock local time, trying to make sure that they are in position to make sure that these far left and far right groups stay as far apart as possible. You see Steve Patterson's camera shot right there. Many people walking the streets, in case you're listening on the radio, with some sort of helmet gear. Impossible, really, to see their faces. Police so far in Portland have mentioned that they have recovered plenty of weapons so far from people, individuals there on the waterfront area. We have seen some loud exchanges and we've heard some loud exchanges, but so far nothing really physical, and that's a good thing. This has been going on for an hour and a half right now. Police have created an actual barrier to separate all the crews. Our NBC's Scott Cohen is there on the scene in downtown Portland. Scott, what's the scene like besides the weird oddities of that unicorn that seems to like following you along? Or there are two. It doesn't make it a unicorn if you see two.
We're seeing a bit of a shift now where some of the protesters have split off from the park and they're headed to the west, and we've seen a few things thrown around. A mayonnaise jar came at us a little while ago, so we're keeping careful here. This is where things start to change a little bit. We've seen this in the past, and it gets a little bit trickier as they move into the streets of the city. And the police, again, trying to keep them cordoned, keep the protesters on either side apart. And it does seem to be getting to that point in the day here where things are shifting. Again, it's not concentrated. There hadn't been any huge confrontations, a lot of verbal shouting back and forth. Police have opened NATO Parkway, which is the street that runs alongside the Riverfront Park. They've opened it up back to traffic now, but continue to make announcements telling people to obey the traffic laws, to use the crosswalks and so on. And again, at this point, it's still on the orderly side with occasional skirmishes breaking out.
And Scott, for the most part, the police have been out in force. I know that many the local businesses have been closed. Do you get a sense that the cops were prepared for this?
Well, they certainly seem to have been, and there has been a big show of force. And as we've been reporting, there's been this subtle, I guess, or maybe not so subtle change in tactics where they deployed these liaison officers, and it's emblazoned on their uniforms to try and talk to the protesters beforehand. But there's also a sense of, you know, trying to figure out what the strategy is on both sides. Joe Biggs, who was one of the organizers of the rally, the original rally on the right, the so-called End Domestic Terrorism rally, is claiming now that they came here just to troll the left, planted a flag and left. It's hard to tell about that, but there are. Again, from our very limited perspective, and I hesitate to make judgments about this whole area because it's a large area, but it certainly seems like there are more demonstrators on the left, or at least dressed in the garb of the left, than there are on the right, and that perhaps they, you know, everybody's made their point. We would hope. But we'll see what happens again as they start to fan out into the streets of downtown. And again, that's where it gets a little bit tricky for everybody, for businesses that are, a lot of them closed, for the police that are trying to keep everybody in line, for the protesters, and for us trying to follow it all.
Well, the good thing is the core, at least, of the Rose City, as Portland is known right there, is a relatively small area. It's a large city overall, but the downtown area is relatively small. So as many of these protesters march around, hopefully the police will be able to find out where they are and things remain fairly calm there. But hundreds of people are on the street on opposing sides. I want to bring in, while we continue to watch these pictures out of Portland, Reuters White House correspondent Jeff Mason, as well as Chief Washington correspondent for Bloomberg News, Kevin Cirilli, the gentleman joining us from Washington, D.C. And Jeff, to you first, because the president kind of weighed in on all of this morning, saying that he's considering naming Antifa an organization of terror. What do you make of that?
Well, the president has really sort of focused in on Antifa before, and this goes back a little bit to, or at least draws reminiscence to the Charlottesville controversy and him saying that there were good people on both sides. He has definitely focused his negative energy in Antifa, and I suspect that that's probably what he's doing here too, is trying to demonize that organization and not put as much focus on the other side. But I think it's important to him and to some people on the right side of the quote-unquote conservative right side of this discussion to say, look, this is an organization that does not deserve support or positive feelings.
And Kevin, why? Any idea why the president would try to demonize Antifa as opposed to the other groups that are there in Portland?
Well, President Trump, to echo what Jeff said, I mean, President Trump has consistently tried to raise Antifa as, in terms of defining who his opposition is. And so that, I think, is the strategy that you're seeing here. But I think collectively, Candace, when you look just from a top-line view to see where everything is at this moment and this point in the summer, I mean, we've had countless shootings. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle had said that when they return from summer recess that they are going to try to get some type of bipartisan reform accomplished in September, in October. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has said as much. I mean, this is truthfully a pivotal moment right now in terms of all of the angst that has really captivated the country's attention.
Yeah, it really is a pivotal moment for the country. And Jeff, as I look at these pictures there of all that is playing out in Portland, and while it seems peaceful, it seemed to be reminiscent of the divide that is right now ripping this country apart in many ways and will continue through the election of next year.
Yeah, there's no question that there's a divide on so many issues, but certainly on this issue of gun control. And it's a divide that presents itself both in these pictures that you're showing here, but also in the political rallies that Kevin and I probably go to in our jobs covering the president and covering the Democrats. It is a fractured country on issues political and beyond.
And Kevin,
Can I jump in here?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I'm here in Philadelphia. You know, I grew up outside of Philadelphia. I'm here in Philadelphia, and what this city had to endure earlier this week with the shooting of police officers. And we talk enough about the political implications of that, but for a nearly 7.5-hour standoff with that shooter, and you had children who were literally on lockdown in preschool and in kindergarten. And, we talk a lot about national media. I've been glued to the Philadelphia Inquirer's coverage of this because what the effect that these shootings have on communities is something that stays with them for a lifetime. That's the conversation. I mean, yes, the Republicans and Democrats are worlds apart on a host of different policy issues as it pertains to gun reform legislation. But when you get down into the weeds on issues like information sharing and public and private partnership, ways that the big tech sector can work with local and federal law enforcement agencies to provide information sharing, to maybe monitor folks who are on some type of list, who maybe are clicking on things or are posting threats about things. That's where enough of the divide. That's where Republicans and Democrats in September and October might be able to actually get something done.
But that's how the police department there, at least in Portland, knew about these protests. They've been monitoring these groups for several months now. I just saw the police chief talking about it a few moments ago. The situation that took place in Philadelphia, that's just one of those, sadly, one of those random things that took place. Somebody who was armed to the teeth with plenty of guns and
who had a record
and did have a record, indeed. It's very difficult to kind of monitor individuals like that, whereas you see this sort of thing play out in the city of Portland, and you see that it has stayed relatively calm so far, and you kind of do have to give props to a little bit of the policing, at least at this point. Right, Kevin?
Absolutely. Absolutely, and I think there has to be a conversation. And when I talk with sources in the Democratic Party, as well as, yes, Republican sources, there has to be some type of conversation about ways that the public and the private sector can work with law enforcement, can work with federal enforcement to better protect against domestic terrorism. We've seen it work internationally. In the cases of stopping terrorism abroad, there has to be some type of solution, and that's really, I think, an area based upon my reporting where I can tell you that there appears to be growing consensus. And again, there are worlds apart of differences, but there appears to be growing consensus about ways that the public and the private sector can work together to monitor these social media platforms.
That indeed, it's very important indeed. And as Kevin was speaking in the center of the screen, one protester who I think I've seen several times as I've been watching this live picture for more than an hour and a half now. And he appeared to be a vocal protester early on. He finally made his way into the middle of the street, and that is the red line for many police officers there in Portland. They're saying you can protest all you want, but they've been trying to create this physical barrier that is many of the streets there in Portland. And that young man walked into the street, and they finally took him into handcuffs there. Mark Claxton is listening and watching all of this. He's a retired NYPD detective and director of the Black Law Enforcement Alliance with us. And Mark, I know that you can't necessarily see what was taking place, but as I mentioned, the police officers there dressed very much in tactical gear, plenty of bicycle officers as well, trying to make sure that nobody, not one person, walks into that street and try to start any sort of activity with the other person or the other groups on the opposing side. This typical of the tactic, or how do you handle something like this?
Yeah, absolutely typical of the tactics. I mean, basically what you're trying to do is to keep those two differing or opposing viewpoints separated. You want to create in between the two separate protest operations, you want to create a safe zone, a zone of space. There's some separation between the two to avoid any physical contacts, and to also provide an access for emergency services if necessary. So it's very typical of what occurs in large demonstrations where you have, these pro and con counterpoint positions.
Mark, if you were in charge of an operation like this, would you allow, I know, as I mentioned, they have created somewhat of a physical barrier with the river itself, as well as with plenty of the streets, the Nadeau Parkway, which is a major parkway street downtown in Portland there. But we've seen other occasions and other camera angles where you have people who would appear on opposing sides coming face to face. It would seem, as the police chief said, a powder keg and just waiting for something to happen. How do you police something like this?
It's very challenging, and really you have to deal with the resources that you have. Oftentimes, and most times as a matter of fact, you're not going to have the full contingent of resources that you may need to keep total and complete separation of those two opposing viewpoints, but you do the best you can and you minimize the risk. And you shift personnel around according to locations that may have more demonstrators in them. So, I mean, it's always a huge challenge, but there's a finite amount of law enforcement personnel on the scene, and you have to really work at managing your resources at those scenes.
Yeah, and the police department saying they have more than 1,000 officers, which is a good chunk of the police force out on the streets there. Many people working overtime today. They are saying, Mark, that they have recovered plenty of weapons from individuals who are trying to infiltrate, I should say, opposing groups. And there are reports, they say, of individuals carrying weapons and wearing protective equipment in multiple locations. That would seem like a nightmare setup scenario for me.
It's an absolute nightmare for law enforcement. And see, this is, like I always tell people, you know, police officers don't get paid for what they do. They get paid for what they may have to do one day. And putting themselves in harm's way is routine for law enforcement officers. And in cases like this, you realize that there is a risk not only to, you know, the opposing viewpoints on each side of the march, but to your colleagues, yourself. So you have to work and operate in a sensible, smart way. You have to make really hard judgment calls. You have to be creative operationally, and you have to be really committed to providing effective, fair law enforcement, you know, just to make sure that everyone is safe, the community and your colleagues.
That indeed. I appreciate, Mark, you being here with us. If you're just tuning in or listening right now, we have noticed a few arrests, but things have stayed relatively calm there in the Pacific Northwest city of Portland, Oregon, where you have hundreds of right-wing activists as well as far-left folks who are gathering downtown for dueling rallies. Police have created a physical barrier all throughout the downtown area. Several major businesses have been closed. Hotels have been warning people, many of their guests, to stay away from this situation. They have closed several of the bridges. Of course, Portland is known for its beautiful bridges, but several of them are closed as a result of this, and several streets as well. Police forming that physical barrier. One of the groups, the Proud Boys, and their supporters have made their way. This has been taking place for some 2 hours now as we've watched the situation there. But things, as we mentioned, have stayed relatively calm. It has stayed fairly loud and at times fairly weird, but it is the city of Portland that we've come to know. We'll continue to watch the multiple camera angles there, including the helicopter shot that you're watching as we fly over the city of Portland and that tense situation right now.
Antifa squaring off against several far-right groups that have descended on that city. Nearly 1,000 police officers, along with state police and the FBI. They're on the scene right now. You can see some of the pictures we're following. They promise they will use the full force of the law against anyone committing acts of violence or vandalism. It's a situation not helped by President Trump tweeting about the protests, noting there's major consideration to name the far-left group Antifa, quote, an organization of terror. He only singled out the far-left group and not the far-right and neo-Nazi groups also gathered in Portland right now. Joining us live, NBC's Scott Cohn on the ground in Portland. And Scott, as I've been watching you throughout this Saturday, it has both been quite energetic, loud, and now, as we can see in the location you're at now in Portland, a little bit different.
Yeah, it seems to be, it's been relatively peaceful throughout the day, at least, you know, verbal confrontations, things like that, but nothing much in the way of physical violence. And some of it has to do with the very large police presence, which was announced beforehand. This is the Hawthorne Bridge, which has been closed since 4 o'clock this morning. You can see the police guarding that perimeter. There was a point earlier where they allowed some of the protesters to march over the bridge. But that was done pretty quickly. And now people we're kind of into that phase where people are starting to mill around. There are small groups of kind of clusters of people, the occasional confrontation, and the police sound truck, which is a ubiquitous presence around here, telling people that there is no permit to be in the streets, to be marching, who are in the streets, who are off of the sidewalks, who are not obeying traffic laws, are subject to arrest. We've seen a couple of arrests here and there, but again, it has been remarkably peaceful given the amount of demonstrators on both sides that began showing up this morning, 9, 10 o'clock this morning, and still continue. And you still see them milling around, but it could be a a tribute to that police presence, which they've been telegraphing for several days, and different tactics on the part of the police, including liaison officers that were deployed within the protesters to try and calm the tensions and also, I guess, get a sense of where people were going. So again, as of now, and these things have ways of flaring up as they continue to go on, but as of now, it's a tense calm.
Hey, Scott, give us a quick summary. What is the messaging you're hearing from the far right groups? What is the messaging coming from the far left groups?
The far-right groups who staged this to begin with were calling it a rally to end domestic terrorism. Now, Joe Biggs, who is one of the organizers, who's a former staffer with Alex Jones' InfoWars group, is saying that it was all trolling the left and trying to show them up for what they say are the terrorists that they are. On the left, and people have pointed out to me that the Antifa is not all left-wing people, but on the left, they've come out to say that this is our city. You can't come in here and disrupt it. You can't come in and preach hate. And as a result, you know, that's the messaging that they've been spreading. Right now, a fairly quiet group of people just walking across First Avenue, which is just to the west of the riverfront where the protests began. It is, thankfully, as I said, fairly calm.
You know, watching the signs, hearing the chants, this is what you're able to see and report for us, Scott. When the right groups are messaging here, how are they expressing what they believe domestic terrorism is, since they're saying they'd like to eliminate that?
Well, I mean, it's a lot of what they were talking about going into this, and it's the things that you typically see at these rallies, and you know what they've said. And again, everything that you hear coming from, I suppose, either side. There's a fair amount of spin here, but what the right-wing side is saying that we came here, we said a prayer, we planted a flag, and we left. From what we've been able to see, and again, my perspective is very limited to whatever kind of block that I'm at, but what we've seen is a lot more counter-protesters than actual right-wing protesters.
And hey, look, it's really tough. We've all been in this situation before here, Scott. Would you say that, is it a 2-to-1? Is it a 3-to-2? How would you roughly sort of put your arms around one side versus the other in terms of numbers?
It's really difficult for me to say because you know what happened when this was all starting out was literally the protesters or the counter protesters, they had gathered on either end of this long riverfront park, and as you know, as you're facing the river, the left-wing protesters were on the left or the north, and the right-wing protesters were to the south, and so as we were going through this, it's a very limited perspective. So I don't really feel comfortable getting into what were the ratios because I didn't have a wide enough view to be able to see it, quite frankly.
Understood. Scott Cohn, right in the middle of things there in Portland, Oregon, as we do see two rallies, one on each side of the political spectrum. It has been described, protesting and walking and demonstrating. Scott, we're going to let you get out and do some reporting, and we'll touch base with you a little bit later in this hour, no doubt. There are also... And welcome back. We are watching live pictures coming out of Portland, Oregon. This is two opposing groups that are facing off in marches across the country. In addition to that, we are also watching gun violence protests across the country. Those are two ongoing events throughout this hour. I want to allude to one of the tweets that came out today from Donald Trump. The president saying major consideration is being given to naming Antifa an organization of terror. Portland is being watched very closely. Hopefully the mayor will be able to properly do his job. That coming from the president. So that is the thematic around Portland, Oregon. Joining us now, Susan Del Percio, Republican strategist, and MSNBC political analyst, Basil Smykel, Democratic strategist, former executive director of the New York Democratic Party. So those are two of the stories we're watching, and we'll get to some of the pictures when we can. Basil, we're looking at very extreme emotions, very extreme ideas on both sides in Portland, Oregon. At least that's what both sides would say and characterize the other group as. What are we seeing being carried out here right now when we have at 50,000 feet a president that is focusing just on one side?
What we have is what I've been long afraid of, and many have been, which is that this president is stoking this kind of anger and extremism on both sides. It's not, and I want to be clear here, as we were talking about earlier, it is not Democrat versus Republican. It is extremes on either side, on both sides. And that is a danger that I have been long worried about, and as I said, many others have been since this president took office. And what we need to see is someone who understands how to bring the country together, how to heal, how to console, how to say, and then and Susan, I think, had mentioned this as well when we were talking earlier, talk about American values and us not being this way. This is not who we are, but we don't have that.
Well, what are the two sides you're talking about?
Well, look, I don't think there's any policy coming out of what we're seeing here, right? And that's I think the important point to remember.
They're not
that
political.
You can be,
we talk about this. They're not political
not,
organizations as much as there's a bunch of white supremacists or nationalists versus a bunch of anarchists. These are just groups of extremes that have their views, but they're not looking for any solutions.
Yeah, it's not policy oriented. They're actually just looking for ways to express anger. It's a vehicle, but it's not a solution.
And I think that they're looking for trouble right now, and that's what we see right now.
So you're saying this is an expression of anger, that they just want trouble?
I think it's a criminal. It will lead to criminal acts. This is not an expression. They're not trying to voice and to have the people come around them for a moment or even a piece of legislation. There's nothing. They're looking to be loud and frankly, I think it will lead to, we know it leads to some kind of violence. It's a matter of what extreme it goes to.
And I'll go back to what the Associated Press is saying, that in Portland, police there have seized metal and wooden poles. These are weapons as they describe them, bear spray, shields as well, from multiple groups at a right-wing rally and counter-protest in that city.
And it's still daylight, which is important to recognize. When trouble really starts is as the sun goes down. Emotions will even run higher.
Yes, I've been there when the sun goes down. You don't want to be there during these situations if it does go bad.
Let me say this, because I can see where this is going.
Yeah.
You know, when people of color and people of conscience come out and protest police brutality, for example, when they protest actual policies that they want, that they feel is being discriminatory or in favor of policies that they want to see from this government, this is what I see is this president sort of conflating these two things, Antifa and the kind of extremism we may see here, and people that actually care about good policy and are fighting for equity.
But is this about the president?
Well, to some extent, I think it is, because what we're seeing, the conflict in Portland, and what we're seeing as far as the rallies for supporting gun safety measures, has one thing in common. The president shows no empathy to its victims. And the president doesn't try and I hate to use the word console because he's not able to do it. I mean, it's just not in his vocabulary. But he's not even able to show leadership. A leader of our country would be able to try and at least temper the talk down.
Look, the thematic, as you saw in the tweet there, you're going after one side, not the other. This fits in with the criticism.
And that's why he's called a racist. When you support the Proud Boys, which he's doing by not mentioning them,
that's one of the groups on the right there.
Correct. You are endorsing white nationalists, white supremacy, full stop.
And that's why I go back to the point about this isn't, what he's doing is setting up a narrative where he then goes after the left on people that are actually pushing sound policy, because he wants to equate these two things and say, look, to the Proud Boys and to the folks at his rallies, hey, these are our enemies, and that's what's dangerous.
Let me bring in another wise voice, shall I say, to the table here. Live on the phone, Brian Levin, Director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism. Brian, thanks for being with us. You're on the phone right now. You're watching some of the live pictures coming out of Portland, Oregon. This is not the first time we have seen such conflict on the streets of America. You just issued a report describing Antifa as well as the groups on the far right. How would you explain what we're seeing in Portland right now to somebody who has not been exposed to this before?
Big difference. Look, Portland is a place where the fault lines between left and right have ruptured. But I don't think we could suggest that at this point that every city has that kind of threat. When we were doing a study here in California, for instance, we found during a certain political season a doubling of violent public demonstrations, but they were concentrated, listen to this, in Orange County, California, where we had the political demographics changing for the first time since the Depression to Democrat, and also Berkeley. So bottom line is Portland, might certainly be a precursor to other places, but I would not say that it's representative of either Antifa in general or the kind of risk of violence from these demonstrations across the country. That being said, what we've seen is we go into a political season, we see spikes. So give an example, not just in violent demonstrations, we see spikes in hate on the internet, and we also see spikes in hate crime. So for instance, around election time last year, spikes in hate crimes, spikes in murders. But when people try to compare Antifa to, for instance, white supremacists, we've had no fatalities from Antifa over the last couple of years. We recently had a shooting, but we have no fatalities from those extremists, but we've had 26 so far this year from white supremacists.
Brian, so you're tracking how this is arcing, right? Give me the run rate here. What are we looking at in terms of these sorts of demonstrations and conflicts? You can do year to date. You can give me annualized. Are we going up by 40%? What are you seeing?
Well, what we've been seeing is much more fatal attacks involving mass killings by white supremacists. But we have seen a string of attacks by suspected Antifa, and they seem to be getting more violent. We're also seeing folks on the hard left speaking more about confrontation. That being said, you can't equalize it. We had 3 white supremacist homicides in 2016. We had 26 this year alone. That's more than all the extremist homicides from everybody for all of last year. So you really got to put it in perspective. What Antifa does, they have a spectrum of people who go from boisterous protesting all the way to assaults. But bottom line is, I think most of them, if pressed, would try to avoid physical violence, although there is a sliver that doesn't care and enjoys confrontation.
I listen to that and I just keep thinking about how, sometimes I get the sense that we have leaders in this country and a president in this country who is going around basically saying that your neighbor is your enemy. And that is that scares me. And I understand what he's saying in terms of the demographics changing, and this is Portland, and it may not be the case in other cities, but I fear that it gets to those other cities because the demographics are changing so dramatically.
It does, and when you have an environment of us versus them as the main political dialogue coming out of the White House, that sets a dangerous precedent. There's no question about it. And that's what I'm also concerned about as we start going into the political season is, the people we see there, they're not people who support Bernie Sanders, just like the people on the Proud Boys aren't people who go to the rally for pro-life rally on the mall. These are such extremists, but there's when the President of the United States starts to bring them into the main, or trying to bring them into the main line, that's a really dangerous place.
And as Brian said, this is a fault line. We are not necessarily seeing this as a string that runs through all the major cities of America. This is a fault line, right? Berkeley, he brought up, Orange County, Portland, Oregon, other places throughout the country.
I think we're just a match, throwing a lit match away from happening in any major city.
And he is hoping, as the two of you are, that this is not the case.
Of course.
Brian Levin, thank you so much. Pazel Smikle, Susan Del Percio of It's Saturday. They are here at 4 o'clock. Thank you both. Up next.